I want you to imagine for a second that you are strapped into this tiny, cramped metal capsule.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right, and outside, there is just this brutal, blinding ice storm raging. I mean, visibility is basically zero, and the ground below you is just a completely frozen wasteland.
Sounds incredibly bleak.
Oh, it is. But then suddenly you are launched from an armored personnel carrier just rocketing straight up into the sky. And your target is this colossal hovering dreadnought.
Oh man, yeah, the Titan.
Exactly. It's this flying fortress wrapped in energy shields. You smash onto the outer deck, pop the hatch, and you're just sprinting down these narrow, futuristic corridors, right?
Yeah.
Desperately fighting your way toward a glowing reactor core before the entire ship goes nuclear.
It was such an intense experience.
It really was. But here's the crazy part. Imagine putting down the controller, waiting nearly 20 years, and realizing that the absolute best way for developers to recreate that exact same thrill is to actually strip away the future entirely. Welcome to the deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So we have this massive stack of wiki sources today, and we are looking at two vastly different eras of a legendary gaming franchise. We are covering Battlefield 2142, which, dropped way back in October 2006.
Wow, almost 20 years ago.
I know, it makes me feel old. But we are comparing it to the absolute juggernaut that is Battlefield 6, which just released in late 2025.
And it is just a fascinating case study in digital architecture, really.
Right?
Because we are looking at this massive gap in game development. I mean, huge leaps in engine technology, completely different player expectations today, and yet we see this incredibly deliberate return to a very specific foundation from 2006.
Yeah, and on the surface, these two digital worlds, they look like they shouldn't even be in the same conversation.
Totally different vibes.
Exactly. Because in 2142, the premise is just bleak. It's over 100 years in the future. Humanity is dealing with this catastrophic, rapidly advancing new ice age.
Right, the glaciers are basically swallowing the northern hemisphere.
Yeah, so the habitable warm land is shrinking every single day. And it forces these two super factions, the European Union and the Pan-Asian Coalition, into this brutal global war over whatever is left.
Fighting over scraps, basically.
Right. And you are fighting in the snow with, active camouflage, hover tanks, and these towering bipedal mechs. But the defining feature of this 2006 game is what I just described in the intro, right? Titan mode.
Oh, Titan mode, yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. How does a 64-player server actually coordinate to take down a massive flying warship?
Well, it actually requires this massive psychological shift halfway through the match. And that is really what made it so revolutionary at the time.
Okay, how so?
So in a standard game, your 64 players are just spread out, right? Capturing flags on the ground. But Titan mode introduces this colossal, heavily armed flying dreadnought.
The commander can actually drive it around.
Exactly. The team's commander can literally steer it around the sky.
Yeah.
And you can't just, shoot it down with a standard rocket launcher.
Right, that would be too easy.
Way too easy. So players on the ground have to fight tooth and nail just to capture these anti-Titan missile silos. Because as long as your team holds the silo, it automatically fires massive projectiles up into the sky to batter down the Titan's energy shield.
Okay, so the first half of the game is just this sprawling, wide-open territorial ground war.
Precisely. But once those shields are finally down, the spatial dynamics just completely invert.
The map basically changes.
Completely. You go from a macro-level ground war to this micro-level, intensely claustrophobic siege. Players physically board the Titan using air transports or, like you said, those assault capsules.
Which is just so cool.
It is, and suddenly, those exact same 64 players who were just driving tanks across an open tundra, they are funneled into these tight, linear hallways inside the ship, just fighting room by room to destroy the reactor core.
It's an incredible shift in pacing, but then, we look at the sources for Battlefield 6, released in 2025, and all of that wild, ambitious sci-fi scale is just gone.
It's completely stripped out.
Yeah, the Ice Age is gone, the Titans are gone, we are dropped into the year 2027, and it's this very grounded, gritty, modern-day proxy war.
Okay.
You play the campaign as Dylan Murphy in this elite Marine unit called Dagger 1-3, and instead of fighting over the last patch of warm dirt, NATO is fighting this massive private military corporation called Pax Armada.
Yeah, it's a huge shift in tone.
It's all cybersecurity hacks, assassinations, and this thing called Project Velis, which is basically tech designed to completely blind global satellite imagery.
Right, well, it is entirely grounded in the anxieties of the 2020s.
Right.
We moved from climate collapse
Yeah.
to, rogue states, private military contractors, and information warfare.
It feels very real.
It really does. It's a very tactical, almost Tom Clancy-esque thriller now.
And this is where the franchise's evolution gets really interesting to me. Because the narrative shifts from extreme sci-fi to modern realism, right?
Yeah.
But the mechanical engine running underneath the game actually moves backward.
That's a great way to put it.
Right, because the sources heavily emphasize that Battlefield 6 took this deliberate, highly publicized back-to-basics approach.
They really leaned into that marketing.
They did. They explicitly abandoned a decade of experimental mechanics. Specifically, they ditched this system where players played as individual specialist characters.
Right, the hero shooter trend.
Exactly. And they reverted completely to the classic 64-player scale and the strict, rigid class system straight out of the 2142 era.
Yeah, they had to.
Why, though? I mean, it's like a rock band ditching all their shiny new synthesizers to just go back to playing acoustic guitar and drums. Why was going backward the magic bullet here?
Well, what's fascinating here is that they realized they had fundamentally broken the psychological engine of the game.
Oh, really? Broken it how?
So for years, the developers tried to innovate by giving players more and more individual freedom. They introduced those specialists, which basically meant any player could carry any weapon and any gadget.
Right, total freedom.
Exactly. If you wanted to be a sniper who also carried a rocket launcher and a healing crate, you just could.
Which, I mean, on paper, letting players choose whatever they want sounds like a huge net positive for a video game.
It sounds great in a boardroom, but until you are pinned down by enemy fire and you actually need help, you don't realize the issue.
Ah, I see.
In these virtual environments, the core commodity isn't the gun you are holding. It's the predictability of the strangers around you.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, if we compare a 64-player match to, say, a high-stakes bank heist, you need very specific roles.
Or like an Ocean's 11 thing.
Exactly. You
Yeah.
need the safecracker, you need the getaway driver, you need the muscle.
Right.
If everyone shows up to the bank robbery claiming they're a hybrid safecracker driver muscle, the whole operation just collapses.
Nobody knows who's doing what.
Exactly. And when the developers ran their Battlefield Labs testing program before launching Battlefield 6, the data was incredibly clear. Players were suffering from massive cognitive overload.
Because they couldn't read the battlefield anymore.
Right. They couldn't look at a teammate and instantly know what that teammate could do for them. By ripping out those specialists and returning to the classic class system, they restored this unspoken contract of mutual reliance.
Which means we really need to look at exactly how that mutual reliance is structured. Because if that four-class system is the engine that saved the franchise, understanding how it forced this human connection is pretty crucial.
It really is the core DNA.
So in 2142, they condensed dozens of confusing roles from their older games into this hyper-streamlined core four: recon, assault, engineer, and support.
Yep, the classic four.
And then Battlefield 6 just ripped that exact framework straight out of 2006.
They absolutely did, and it is a brilliant ecosystem of vulnerabilities. No single class can actually survive alone.
Give me an example.
Sure, take the assault class.
Yeah.
They're your frontline fighters, right, and your combat medics. They can heal people and revive them, but they are completely helpless against heavy enemy armor.
Right, they just have rifles.
Exactly. If a tank rolls over the hill, the assault player basically has to hide and pray and engineers nearby.
Because the engineer is the safecracker in this scenario.
Precisely. Their entire purpose is anti-vehicle combat and repairing friendly armor.
But wait, if an engineer is staring down the sights of a rocket launcher at a tank, they aren't exactly watching their own back.
Right, they have tunnel vision. They are highly vulnerable to enemy infantry flanking them, so they absolutely need the assault player to keep them alive.
And probably the recon player too, right?
Exactly. The recon handles the sniping and the spotting, so they tell everyone where the threats are even coming from.
But eventually the assault player is going to run out of bandages.
Yeah, and the engineer runs out of rockets, which makes them all entirely dependent on the support class.
Who drops the ammo?
Right. Their whole job is to lay down heavy suppression fire and drop ammunition crates to keep the team going. It is forced codependency by design.
That is brilliant. And the hardware they are using to enforce that codependency is really where the visual contrast between the two games gets so stark for me.
Oh, visually, they are worlds apart.
Right. In 2142, that engineer is staring down a massive bipedal mech, like the EU's L5 Racing or the Pace's T-39 Boketer. It's literally a walking tank with rotary cannons.
It just completely dominates the skyline.
It really does. It towers over the battlefield, and recons are using optic camouflage to bend light and turn practically invisible.
Yeah, very sci-fi.
But then in Battlefield 6, it's purely modern doctrine. You know, you have M1A2 SEPV3 tanks, M3A3 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, F-97 Kestrel jets.
Yeah, the geometry of the threat completely changes. A towering mech in 2142 is this very visible, high-priority target that dictates the flow of the entire map.
You can see it from a mile away.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But a modern tank in 2027 utilizes defilade. It hides behind the terrain, making the engagement much more methodical.
Wait, hold on. Here's where it gets really interesting to me. If I can turn completely invisible in 2006, or throw an EMP grenade to completely fry the circuitry of a walking mech to freeze it in place so my squad can swarm it.
Right.
But then in 2025, I'm literally back to just throwing a standard M67 fragmentation grenade at a Jeep.
I see where you're going with this.
Yeah, like, isn't the gameplay actually devolving? Did they just give the game a modern paint job, strip out all the imaginative mechanics, and call it a day?
I understand why it feels that way, but I have to push back on that a bit. If you look at the underlying mechanics, the gameplay didn't devolve at all. The pacing just shifted to demand a different kind of tactical rigor.
Okay, explain that.
So the sci-fi elements in 2142, the boarding capsules, the hover technology, the EMPs, those tools dramatically accelerate the engagement loop.
Things just happen faster.
Much faster. You get into the fight faster, and the chaos is much more immediate. But the core rock, paper, scissors mechanic remains untouched. You still need the engineer to finish off that frozen mech, and you still need the support player to hand you another EMP grenade.
Right, the codependency is still there.
Exactly. The modern gear in Battlefield 6 strips away that sci-fi speed, which forces a slower, much more deliberate approach to securing an objective.
Because you can't just launch yourself over a wall in a pod anymore.
Right, you have to physically clear the perimeter with your squad. The tools change the speed of the game, but the absolute requirement for diverse team composition is identical.
Okay, that actually makes a lot of sense. The technology dictates the speed of the engagement, but the human element, the fact that I need you to survive, doesn't change at all.
Not quite.
And if that core class system is the engine of the game, then the maps are basically the chassis.
That's a good analogy.
Because you can't just drop these highly interdependent infantry units into a massive open field without the whole thing falling apart. The ground you fight on has to actually force those interactions.
He has to funnel them together.
Right. And the sources focus heavily on this one specific map from 2142 called Tunis Harbour.
Oh, Tunis Harbour. It's legendary.
Reading about it, it sounds like an absolute masterclass in weaponizing claustrophobia. Break it down for me.
Well, the narrative lore of the map sets the tone perfectly. The Pan-Asian Coalition used heavy fog in the Strait of Sicily to land their forces almost directly on top of the European Union's defenses.
Sneak attack.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it pinned the EU forces inside this vital transportation hub with the Mediterranean Sea literally right at their backs.
So there is nowhere to retreat.
None. You fight or you die. And the map architecture reflects that desperation perfectly. It is a dense industrial maze of cargo containers, train cars, and these massive dock cranes.
Lots of hardcover.
Lots of it. It forces medium to close infantry combat. Vehicles are practically useless for pushing the front line. They're forced into a very cautious support role, mostly just guarding the perimeter.
What I found really compelling in the wiki notes is how Tunis Harbour handles different player counts.
Oh, the dynamic layouts, yeah.
Yeah, if you are playing on a smaller 16-player server, the fight is contained to specific ground level areas like the living quarters and the docks office.
Right, it keeps things tight.
But when you scale up to 64 players, the map doesn't just get wider, it gets taller.
Yes, the catwalks.
Exactly. It introduces this extensive interconnected network of elevated catwalks right above the cargo containers. Suddenly, you have multiple vertical layers of combat happening at the same time.
It changes everything.
You have to watch your corners on the ground, but you also have to worry about a recon squad raining fire down on you from a crane 2 stories up. It forces intense squad-level communication.
It creates a total pressure cooker. Every time you turn a corner, you are likely to run into an enemy, which means you absolutely must stay near your medic and your support player.
But here is where the evolution and really the direct positive influence between the two games becomes incredibly concrete.
Okay, let's hear it.
When we look at the maps in Battlefield 6, the scale is completely different from Tunis Harbor. The sources highlight three massive community favorites.
Let me guess, Mirak Valley.
Yep, Mirak Valley, Liberation Peak, and Contaminated.
The big three.
Right. And they are huge. Mirak Valley is set in Tajikistan, and it is this sprawling, war-torn landscape designed to fit every single type of vehicle in the game at the same time.
Massive sandbox.
Liberation Peak is way up in the Pamir Mountains, dealing with extreme altitude and height advantages.
Yeah.
And Contaminated is this German airbase completely covered in toxic psychoactive smoke.
I love that map.
They are massive open-world sandboxes, but here is my question. If you take the tight, deliberate maze of Tunis Harbor where players are forced to bump into each other,
Right.
and you compare it to a giant valley where a player can just wander off into the hills with a sniper rifle, doesn't the massive scale of Battlefield 6 dilute the intense forced teamwork you get in a tightly structured map? How do you anchor 64 players in a giant valley?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, this is exactly where the direct positive influence of 2142 becomes visible.
Really? How so?
The developers of Battlefield 6 didn't abandon the Tunis Harbor philosophy at all. They actually weaponized it to solve the problem of these massive environments.
Okay, I'm listening.
They used a concept that is essentially a Russian nesting doll of level design.
A nesting.
Yeah. To prevent players from wandering aimlessly, they broke these massive maps down into smaller sectors. And inside those sectors, they built highly structured, infantry-focused arenas.
So they essentially hit a bunch of tiny Tunis harbors inside the giant valley.
Exactly.
Right.
Let's look at Mirak Valley. Yes, the map as a whole is a massive vehicular playground, but one of the key capture points is a sector called the Destroyed Village.
Right, I saw that in the notes.
So the developers designed the geometry of the ruins so that tanks and armored vehicles cannot easily navigate the rubble.
Oh, so they get stuck.
Right, they get bogged down. If you want to capture that specific point, you have to get out of the vehicle and push it on foot. And the moment you enter the destroyed village, the map flow instantly mimics the tight, cover-heavy, close-quarters chaos of Tunis Harbor.
Wow.
The macro map is massive, but the micro battle is a tightly controlled maze.
That is a phenomenal design solution.
It really is.
Because you satisfy the players who want to fly jets and drive tanks across the valley, but the actual critical objectives force everyone back into that codependent infantry loop.
Exactly. And you can see that direct influence in the other maps too.
Right, like Contaminated.
Yeah, Contaminated has this massive open runway for the vehicles,
Yeah.
but the core objectives are the Zone C bunker and the maintenance hangar.
Which are tight interiors.
Exactly, tight claustrophobic interiors where that toxic smoke forces everyone close together, just like the fog in Tunis Harbor.
Oh, that's such a good parallel.
And we see the influence of Tunis Harbor's catwalks in Liberation Peak too.
Because of the mountains.
Right, the map is set in the mountains, so the terrain itself provides the verticality. You have tanks fighting on the lower roads, but infantry are fighting on the steep, rocky slopes right above them.
So you always have to look up, just like the cranes in 2006.
Exactly. The developers learned back in 2006 that human psychology craves structure. No matter how massive your rendering engine allows the world to be, if you don't give the human brain readable, structured arenas with clear sightlines and obvious cover.
The gameplay just evolves into random noise.
Exactly, it becomes frustrating. By nesting those dense, highly engineered infantry zones inside the massive modern maps, they managed to control the chaos.
They took the best part of a 2006 Harbour siege and used it to anchor a 2027 Valley War.
It's a brilliant evolution.
It really is. And, you know, whether you are someone who spent hours mastering the thermal scopes in a modern tank, or you still have fond memories of launching yourself in a pod toward a hovering dreadnought, understanding how these digital spaces are built is just a masterclass in design.
It really is behavioral psychology in action.
Yeah, the developers figured out that true engagement doesn't come from giving you total freedom. It comes from restricting your tools just enough that you have to rely on a total stranger to survive.
Forced reliance.
Right, that delicate ecosystem, the safecracker, the muscle, the medic, is the load-bearing wall of the entire franchise. You can change the wallpaper, you can upgrade the graphics, but you just don't mess with the foundation.
No, you don't. It is a powerful reminder that while technology advances at breakneck speed, the fundamental drivers of human cooperation remain largely unchanged.
We really do thrive on mutual reliance, especially under pressure.
We do. And, there is one final, rather provocative detail. hidden in these sources that highlights exactly how the real world around these games has changed.
Oh, let's hear it.
Well, just consider the shift in the core anxieties driving the narratives.
Okay.
When Battlefield 2142 was being developed in the mid-2000s, the ultimate existential fear they chose to depict was ecological.
Right, the new Ice Age.
Exactly. It was a massive, uncontrollable shift in the climate that drove humanity to the brink. It was a fear of the natural world basically turning against us.
Yeah.
But when they sat down to design Battlefield 6 in the 2020s, the nightmare had completely shifted.
Oh, wow. Yeah, there's no natural disaster in Battlefield 6.
None at all. The disaster is entirely man-made. The anxiety is about rogue private military corporations, the collapse of institutional alliances like NATO, cybersecurity breaches.
And the weaponization of information, like Project Veilus blinding the satellites.
Exactly.
That is a deeply unsettling realization.
It really begs a profound question for anyone who spends time in these virtual spaces. What do the fictional digital wars we choose to simulate say about the very real evolving fears of the society that programs them?
That's a heavy thought.
Over 2 decades, our collective nightmares shifted from the uncontrollable weather outside our windows to the technology in our pockets and the fragility of the institutions we built to protect us.
Well, if you've ever felt a strange, unspoken connection when a random stranger risks their virtual life to revive you in the middle of a chaotic firefight, now you know why.
The developers are pulling your psychological strings, forcing you into a survival ecosystem that hasn't changed in 20 years. The mechanics of survival are exactly the same. It's just the monsters we are surviving against that keep changing. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.